can't tell you what a treat it is for me personally to welcome Paul Krugman back to Yale. Paul is a Yale graduate, class of 1974. He went off and did his PhD in near record time at MIT and returned to Yale in 1977 to join the economics department faculty for the all too brief period of 2 years. But let me tell you, at that point, I got my degree, my PhD, from the economics department in 1974, the same year that Paul left to go to graduate school. But when he came back, we had offices next door, or we couldn't remember if it was next door or across the hall, on the third floor of 28 Hillhouse Avenue. It was pretty seedy then, and it's still pretty seedy. Paul remembered the bathtub in his office, and I said, no, it wasn't actually in your office, it was across the hall. But it was not the greatest accommodations, but we had a very lively time. And this was exactly the period in Paul's career where he was working out the ideas that led to his Nobel Prize, the notion of integrating some of the theoretical ideas from industrial organization economics into the international trade framework of comparative advantage. These were brilliant papers, beautiful and simple, and not so technically sophisticated that any graduate student, even any undergraduate, could easily understand the basic idea. Extraordinary pieces of work, and I remember many conversations at the time, since I was the industrial organization guy that Paul had next door to talk to as he sort of worked toward this synthesis. And it was a remarkable experience for me to see such a creative and innovative young economist doing such powerful and important work. And so none of us at Yale were the least bit surprised. We were disappointed to lose him back to MIT in 1979, but none of us were surprised when years later he first got the John Bates Clark Medal for distinguished contributions in economics for economists under the age of 40, and then subsequently won the Nobel Prize for an entire body of work that makes impressive contributions to the understanding of international trade and finance. Paul has gone on, whilst taking academic positions at Stanford and Princeton, where he currently is, as well as MIT and Yale, where he'd been before, and continued to be active for many years in research. In recent years, of course, we all know him as the person whose column we read first when we turn to the op-ed pages of the New York Times, as a person whose vigorous and lucid prose enlightens us about the state of the world and contemporary economics and the politics of contemporary economics. Paul writes with a sharpness that puts things into very clear relief. He writes from a perspective that we both recognize as the perspective of what in our day when we were students was known to be kind of the Yale-MIT axis on macroeconomics and monetary policy, a wisdom that unfortunately got forgotten for 20 years or so during the period, actually more than 20 years, from the Reagan years until the great crisis of 2008, a wisdom that we're relearning thanks very much to Paul's own very lucid writing and exposition of key ideas about what's the appropriate mix of monetary and fiscal policy in a crisis, what is what can and what can't monetary policy actually accomplish, and not to mention all of his other work on other important aspects of economic and social policy, his strong position on healthcare and so forth. I'm not going to take a position. I will certainly take a position on the monetary and fiscal stuff, which I think he has been 100% on the mark in pointing out important pitfalls in the kind of thinking that's dominated macroeconomic policy for the last 3 decades. I think we're going to see a change, as we often do after deep recessions, and more intelligent thinking that recognizes that things can indeed go wrong and that there are ways to fix the things that go wrong. Anyway, enough about my ideas. We're delighted to have Paul back, And we wanted to do something a little special and not just have him speak to you, but actually recognize from Yale's perspective this contribution of this extraordinary distinguished alumnus of Yale College. And so we have our own medal to give. The Howland Memorial Prize was established in 1915 by Charles Howland, who was a graduate of Yale College, 1891, and Francis Howland and John Howland, graduate of 1894, to honor their father, who was a Yale BA from 1854, and a fellow of the Yale Corporation. And the prize is, according to the citation, awarded to a citizen of any country in recognition of some achievement of marked distinction in the field of literature, the fine arts, or the theory of government or policy. Well, I think Paul Krugman's work on political economy over the last decade in the New York Times, not to mention his scholarly work, qualifies easily as extraordinary achievement of marked distinction in the theory of government or politics. He's illuminated so many of us and helped us to think in important and critical ways about key issues of our times. It was in the letter that accompanied the gift to Yale from the Howland family. It indicated that an important factor in the selection, and I quote, shall be the idealistic element in the recipient's work. And I think it's great to see in someone of Paul's advanced standing in the profession of economics and in the public eye that continued sense of idealism and hope for the future of this country. This prize has been awarded to distinguished composers, distinguished writers and artists, and distinguished statesmen. Among the recipients, Aaron Copland, Ralph Vaughan Williams, Virgil Thompson, from writers, John Hersey and Rupert Brooke, and people from the world of government and politics, Indira Gandhi, most recently Tony Blair. So, by way of introducing Paul, who will speak to you for a few minutes and then take questions, I'd like to award him with the Henry E. Howland Memorial Prize.
Okay. So this is, I actually have been indulging a lot of nostalgia the last couple of hours because it is going back to 30 years ago, a little bit more. I'm actually impressed at 28 Hill House at the fact that it looks exactly as seedy as it did in 1979. I'm not sure how you do that. You know, it's like the guys who have 3 days stubble all the time. Is that some? So how do you make a building neither improve nor deteriorate? Anyway. Okay, so I really just want to talk for a little bit. I'll talk economics if politics, and everything is political these days, but if politics comes up, fine. But let me just talk a bit about this amazing economic situation, and I mean that in a bad way, that we're now facing. I'm tempted to, well, let me commit a little bit of sacrilege. You know, Martin Luther King said, I had a dream. In my case, I had a nightmare, which was, it goes back about a dozen years. We used to, in the 90s, there was a period when you had great faith that at least certain kinds of economic problems had been solved. That yes, there would always be fluctuations, there would be recessions and booms, but that the really severe stuff, and particularly the really persistent stuff, was something that was not going to happen anymore. The Great Depression had happened, but it had happened because we were ignorant, because people didn't know enough about macroeconomics. They didn't understand in particular what the central bank should do, what the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank or its counterparts would do. Should be doing, and in a famous, actually if you read my column yesterday, in a famous and now infamous set of remarks, the current chairman of the Federal Reserve, on the occasion of Milton Friedman's 90th birthday, said, Friedman had said that the Fed failed to do his job, and that's why we had the Great Depression. And so the current chairman of the Fed said to Milton Friedman, you're right, we did it, we're very sorry, but thanks to you, it won't happen again. Well, actually, by a couple of years before that, some of us already we're starting to have some doubts about whether we were quite as secure in our ability to prevent something like that from happening again. Mainly over the issue of Japan, which slid into a slump. It had a big bubble in real estate in the 1980s, and when the bubble burst, it had a banking crisis, and it never seemed to recover. They did the usual things. The Bank of Japan maybe moved a bit slowly, but it did more or less what you would expect the Federal Reserve to do. It cut interest rates and all of that. And yet the economy stayed depressed, gradually slid into deflation, which was supposed to be something, you know, it's hard to stop inflation because you have to suffer. But stopping deflation, can't you just print money? And it turned out that it wasn't that easy. Turned out that Japan was stuck in this seemingly endless, depressed economic state. And some people looked at that and said, oh, well, that just shows how messed up the Japanese are, and talked about various, you know, features of Japanese institutions and failures of Japanese policymakers. But some people looked at that and said, you know, once you get past the superficial level, Japan's a lot like us. Yeah, they eat more raw fish. And the important things that matter, Japan is a big, politically stable, advanced economy with lots of room for maneuver and policymakers who may not be ideal but aren't idiots. And if they can get caught in that kind of a trap, maybe it could happen to us. Now, when I went to Princeton, and I moved there about 10 years ago, there was actually a small group of Japan warriors. We actually had a kind of a little nest there. So there was myself, Mike Woodford, who's not a household name, but one of our leading macroeconomic theorists now, Lars Svensson, who's now gone back to his native Sweden to try and help their central bank deal with the problems, and the fourth guy, what's his name? Ben Bernanke, don't know what happened to him. All of us basically very worried by the Japanese example, and by implication also, if Japan was having these problems, you know, maybe our view that the Great Depression was something that could easily have been prevented wasn't right either. And so the nightmare was that the United States and other advanced countries besides Japan could find ourselves in this kind of situation, an economic downturn that would not respond, that had developed resistance to the usual antibiotics, and that would be really hard to deal with. And the nightmare has come true. Where we are now is we are very much in the same situation. If you, the difference between us and Japan in, let's say, 1995 is that we're actually doing worse. That we have the same slide towards deflation, lay the numbers on top of one another, and they match almost perfectly, but with much higher unemployment, much more human misery than the Japanese did. And we're finding it, if anything, even harder than Japan did to come to grips with the problem. If you know, we'd had, I think this has been the surprise to me. I'm pretty cynical and pretty pessimistic, but I never imagined that we would have such a complete intellectual collapse in the face of this problem. That the logic of having the government step in to prop up demand while the private sector was unable to spend would be so broadly rejected that we would be unable to get enough consensus to do even a halfway adequate program of fiscal policy. And now with the only players with any freedom of action left is the Federal Reserve, it turns out that there's enormous opposition to them doing anything as well. So what they're doing is actually, in my view, like the stimulus, a step in the right direction, but much too small. But they're catching enormous fire for doing even that. And the level, well, Sarah Palin came out against quantitative easing yesterday. So this is, it's a really awesome thing that's happening. And it certainly is making, and the economists have turned out to be a problem. And what Rick Levin is alluding to here a bit is that we had my view, Rick's view, obviously, we had a pretty reasonable view of how the macroeconomics worked. It was the view that we learned from people like Jim Tobin here. It's something that actually, if you have that picture of how things work in your mind, what's going on now is not that hard to understand. But it was a view that was less rigorous than some people would like. It wasn't derived axiomatically from first principles. And largely for that reason, with perhaps a little bit of a political undertext as well, it was a view that our profession moved steadily away from over the past 30 plus years, to the point where a lot of younger economists actually don't even know any of this stuff. They can't even as a hypothetical, they can't even do it in the subjunctive, saying, well, if it were true that the economy works in the way that Jim Tobin said it did, this is what we should do. They have no idea how to think that way. And so we have a complete lack of a professional, of the kind of professional expertise that might provide some guidance to the political process in dealing with all of this. So, at this point, I guess I'm supposed to say something uplifting and optimistic to set off the discussion. The sun still comes up in the morning. Probably this thing, something will come along to improve the situation. In the long run, you all know the most famous quote in economics from John Maynard Keynes about the long run. In the long run, we are all dead. But I'm worried because Japan is now 18 years into its version of this and still stuck. And so it is an amazing thing. And personally, we did have an election last week. We were probably stalled on policy anyway, but the election pretty much guarantees that there will be no policy response from the US government. Europe is also equally stalled, and Japan is pretty much out of room to do stuff. So we actually have none of the advanced countries able to respond. I was on Lehrer NewsHour last Friday and had an okay discussion with Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who obviously disagrees with me about a bunch of stuff. But unfortunately, my best remark came after they stopped rolling, which was I actually had my solution, which is we need to increase NASA's budget so that we can find another planet to export to. On that note, why don't I throw it up for questions?
So I'd like to ask undergrads who have a chance now to ask Paul Krugman. We've got microphones at both places. You can line up and let's see what happens.
Hi. First of all, can you please come back to Yale? That's the first thing.
Sorry, I didn't quite get that.
Can you please come back to Yale?
Oh. I'll tell you, I did get a little view of the city, and this is not the New Haven I remember, which was really, really scuzzy. So I'm not sure it has that feel anymore. Okay, go ahead.
Second, in your book, Return to Depression Economics, do you talk a lot about the boom-bust cycle? You follow Asia, internet bubble. The updated version has the housing bubble. What are your views on the proposed bubble in treasury bonds and in clean technology, and where do you see that going in the near future?
Okay. So for those who don't know this stuff, interest rates are remarkably low right now. And if you're looking at a bond, the price and the interest rate move in opposite directions. So one way of saying is the price of US government debt is remarkably high right now. And which is, by the way, the opposite of what a lot of people said was going to happen. They were saying, oh, budget deficit, the government's going to have to borrow, interest rates are going to go sky high. And one of the things where I think I can say that those of us who had that that MIT Yale axis view got right was we said that was not going to happen. So then the question is that a bubble? Is that like pets.com? Is the US government the equivalent of pets.com? And I would say no, and I'd say it for two reasons. One is historical. Again, the Japan example. People have been predicting a crash in Japanese bond prices and a surge in Japanese interest rates year after year for 15 years. And it never happens. Japan even got downgraded by Moody's and Standard & Poor's in 2002, and the interest rates ticked up a little bit and then went back down again, because when you're an economy that is really depressed, that means that the interest rates that the central bank can control, short-term interest rates, are going to stay low for a very long time. And if you think the short rates are going to stay low for a very long time, then that drags the long rates down, unless you think the country is actually going to default on its debt, which advanced countries have an amazing ability to service debt in the long run. So it really has to be very extreme for that to become an issue. So, and the other is you can actually do the numbers. So this is probably getting way too wonkish, but in the past, the behavior of the Federal Reserve has been pretty well tracked by something called a Taylor rule, which relates interest rates to unemployment and inflation. Right now, a Taylor rule fitted to past Fed behavior says that the Fed's target interest rate should be about -6%, which is the problem, right? They can't get below zero. But if you take a consensus forecast for the U.S. economy over the next 10 years, so you take the Congressional Budget Office forecast, which I think is way too optimistic. But anyway, you take that in, and you say, well, what would that say? Apply a Taylor rule based on that forecast, what short rates should be over the next 10 years, which is that they stay zero for quite a while and then eventually come back up again. And then you ask what 10-year bond rate would give you the same return as just rolling over short-term debt. I did that a little while back, and it came out at 2.6. Current interest rate is around 2.55. So it's not a sensible model of with a sensible model combined with what I think is actually an over-optimistic forecast gives you interest rates in the vicinity of where we are right now. So I don't see the bubble. This is not like the housing bubble. I thought was the clearest thing I'd ever seen in my life, except that somehow nobody believed it. But this one I think is not a bubble.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon, Professor Krugman. First of all, I should offer you a little disclaimer. I'm Greek.
Yeah.
So, my question is on your Keynesian views of propping up demand via government demand. How do you exactly suppose governments in Europe, US, Japan can do that when they're consistently penalized by borrowing more from the god of the markets? Do you believe that this goal of the balanced budget is something that we should be going for, or that these rating agencies are only hampering our ability to increase demand by debt financing?
Okay. So, by the way, I'm really, Greece has done a lot of damage. Not so much because of the actual consequences of Greek problems in a direct sense, because Greece is a fairly small part of the European economy, but because of what I think of as the Hellenization of economic discourse. Ever since Greece hit the wall, everybody has been said, oh, you mustn't do anything because you'll turn into Greece, and which is a very, very different story. Greece is, first of all, it was running serious budget deficits even in good times. And it has a really bad history. Greece turns out, has been in arrears about half the time since independence. So it's not in the same class as countries like the United States or the UK or Japan. So Greece has turned out to be a really bad influence because people have taken it to mean that we're all in that same position. Now, in terms of what governments can do, the way I see what's going on is that what you have is a situation in which people borrowed a lot. Private sector players borrowed a lot because housing prices were rising, because it had been a long time since there'd been a major financial crisis. Those of you if you've read enough, I'm basically a Minskyite now. So there was the kind of heterodox economist Hyman Minsky, who's now regained a lot of influence posthumously, who said that what you have is these long cycles in which people get increasingly optimistic, they start to get very relaxed about having a lot of debt, and then at a certain point, You have what's the Minsky moment, or alternatively the Wile E. Coyote moment. If you're familiar with the classics, in the Roadrunner cartoons, Wile E. Coyote always runs about 5 steps off the edge of the cliff, and it's when he notices that there's nothing supporting him. So you get the Wile E. Coyote moment when people say suddenly that's too much debt, and then all of the highly indebted players, which is not everybody in the world, is forced into drastic measures to start paying down debt. The trouble is you can't have, which means that they have to spend a lot less than their income. But you can't have the world as a whole. Income has to equal spending. So somebody else must spend more than their income. And that's the role of fiscal policy during this crisis. I mean, what you do normally is you hope that cutting interest rates persuades people who are not debt constrained to spend more, but interest rates hit this lower bound to 0, and so there's only so much you can do there. So because you can't do enough of that, you want governments to spend more during this period, to give you a way to avoid, because if you don't have somebody else spend more, the rest of the world, the non-constrained players have to, one way or another, spend more than their income, and if you can't raise the bridge, you can't get them to spend more, then you lower the water. The income falls. You have a world recession. So the role of government spending is to do this. Now, not everybody can do this. Greece obviously cannot follow a Keynesian policy. Ireland can't follow a Keynesian policy. Although it's worth pointing out that that doesn't mean that their policies don't have Keynesian effects. These austerity measures that are being undertaken in Greece and Ireland and Spain are further depressing their economy, so it's getting even worse. But the United States can. The United States wants to borrow money for 5 years and finances it with bonds that are protected against inflation. It can borrow at an interest rate right now of minus 0.5%. Can borrow for 10 years at an interest rate of, I think, only slightly positive if you take an inflation-protected bond. There is the ability to borrow. Advanced countries have in the past been able to have pretty high debt burdens without really getting into solvency problems. So this is a good time. Now, that doesn't mean you do want to pay that debt down, but you want to do that after enough people have repaired their balance sheets to the point where the private sector can start spending again. And the problem is that we're not doing that. So the problem is we're in a situation where we don't have government spending. Monetary policy has run its course, has run out of room, and so it's pretty grim. But there is really a very, very good case, both from history and from thinking it through, for deficit spending by those governments that can right now.
How much debt is too much debt?
Well, Japan has gross debt that's 200% of GDP, and it can borrow at about 1% interest rates. Now, a lot of that debt is actually owned or offset by assets owned by the Bank of Japan, so it'll be a little bit. Britain had debt that was over 100% of GDP for about 40 years. From the end of World War I until into the 1950s without ever having a problem. So there is some upper limit, but for an advanced country, it's pretty high. Think the United States, my favorite examples for the remarkable ability of advanced countries to have pretty high debt levels is Belgium and Italy, both of which had debt well over 100% of GDP in the late 1990s without any kind of solvency crisis. And I like those two examples precisely because they're not strong governments, right? I mean, these are advanced countries. Belgium, politically weak because it's linguistically divided between the Flemings and the Walloons, and Italy, politically weak because it's Italy. And yet they were able to have these high debt levels without a crisis. So people are way. It's interesting, the markets are entirely sensible. Markets are very relaxed about the debt of US, UK, Japan. It's only, if you ever read, more in my blog than in the columns, I talk about the invisible bond vigilantes. People are constantly being told you have to appease the bond vigilantes, the investors who will go after you for high debt. And I keep on saying, where are they? You're telling me that we need to be afraid of these people, but they exist only in your imagination.
Hello, Mr. Krugman. Let me take this opportunity to thank you for coming out today. I read your column every week, so thank you. Well, recently in the midterm elections, there's been a lot of pressure on China for the appreciation of the Chinese yuan or the renminbi.
Yeah.
So my question is, what role does China play in U.S. financial troubles at the moment? And what role does the valuation of the Chinese renminbi or yuan play in the deflationary spiral we're facing right now?
Okay, so China it's keeping the currency artificially weak. That's not really a question. They have they're buying huge amounts of foreign currency to keep the renminbi from rising, and they're doing that. They're able to do that because they have capital controls. So if you want to sort of measure how far things are off, you would look at two emerging markets, China and Brazil. Brazil, there's been a large rise in the value of the real, and there should be, because money is cheap and Brazil has good investment opportunities. China is keeping their currency low. They're fighting off, there's actually inflationary pressure in China because of their undervalued currency, and so they're raising interest rates and restricting credit to stop inflation while keeping the currency weak. What that does is it means that China is running an artificial trade surplus. And in normal times, you could say, well, great, they're sending us goods cheap, and they're accepting pieces of paper from us. And so in 2005, 2006, you could say that the Chinese were actually doing us a favor with their undervalued currency. But not now, because now we have a world which is awash in unemployed workers, a world that has more savings than it knows what to do with. In a way, that's the definition of our problem. And the Chinese are worsening that problem by running a surplus that sucks demand away from the rest of the world. So, my God, I was about to refer to Ross Perot and the great sucking sound, but a fair number of people here were barely born at that point. So, but there really is a great sucking sound coming from China. Now, it's probably on the order of around 1% of gross world product. So the negative, the Chinese are in effect delivering an anti-stimulus to the rest of us for around 1%, which is not, even if it went away, if we made the Chinese stop doing this, it's not like everything would be fine, but it contributes to the problems to a significant degree. So that's my view on that. It's now, if they stop doing that, what would happen? If they stopped those interventions to keep the currency weak, the currency would rise. How much it would rise, what the right number on the currency is actually, the best estimates say that it's 25%, but we have this is a black art. We don't really quite know what. But I think that the test of it is not what happens to the currency. The test is, do they stop buying many billions of dollars of foreign exchange every month? And that would be the sign that it's happening. And then the question is, what do you do about it, since they refuse to change that? And that's an interesting thing, because what they're doing is functionally equivalent to subsidizing their exports and putting a tax on their imports. It's functionally equivalent to export subsidies plus tariffs. And if they were doing that, then there would be clear remedy under international trade law. The United States and everybody else would be entitled to have countervailing duties. As it is, the trade law, there's kind of just a crack in the trade law, and this falls right into it. So it's not clear quite under the rules of the WTO what remedy there is, but I guess I'm at the point where I think things are bad enough, and this is sufficiently, this is the biggest example of currency manipulation, arguably the biggest example it's certainly the biggest example of currency manipulation in the history of the world. And it's the biggest protectionist measure, because that's what it amounts to, probably in the last 60 years. So I'm of the view that the United States, and preferably in accord with other countries, should say, look, the spirit of the law says this is illegal, and we're going to impose sanctions. And I've been trying to get someone in Washington to someone in the administration to be willing to actually move on that. I think if this goes on, it will happen. You know, basically, Obama has no ability to get any legislation forward on anything. If he wanted to pass the Motherhood and Apple Pie Act, the Republicans would say that motherhood and apple pie are evil socialist plots. But a proposal for trade sanctions on China would have 80 senators and 380 representatives behind it. So this is something he could do.
Thank you very much.
My question was basically, in 2008, in the run-up during the presidential campaign, President Obama said, you can't have the same people and expect different results. And then as soon as he was sworn into office, we saw a lot of the Clinton economic team back who had bought into a lot of the policies we're talking about that kind of let us down over the past 30 years. And my guess is that last Tuesday you didn't see any policymaker who's really going to swing the tide come into office. So with Larry Summers and a few others heading out the door, it looks like in the next year or so, is there anyone in the Obama administration now, in the Federal Reserve, moving up through the ranks, who I won't go as far as to say, lets you sleep at night, but maybe like for a few minutes, you have a momentary like feeling of, things might be okay.
Oh boy, yeah. Let me just say a word about staffing. I mean, I understand that you wanted to have people in the administration who were old hands to some degree, were trusted by the markets. So you wouldn't have wanted to fill all of the ranks of economic policy with people from the more aggressive people on the liberal side of things. But what was really striking is there were none. When you looked at the appointments, you're saying, okay, where are the people from Economic Policy Institute, which is labor connected, and they have an agenda, they have a position, but they also have good people there. So why isn't Larry Michel in the administration? Why there were essentially there was only one sort of economist with progressive cred, if you like, who was brought on, and that's Jared Bernstein, who's working for Joe Biden. Nobody in the White House group. And that was surprising. And maybe things would have been better if there had been more of those. At this point, wow. I mean, I think Ben Bernanke understands the gravity of the situation, but he's being very cautious, and I don't know whether in his heart of hearts he believes he should be doing vastly more, but he's being political or not. My guess is he probably is pushing as much as he thinks he can. Let me tell you, I'm not sure what I think even now of his job at the Fed, but he was the best department chairman I've ever had, so he probably is very good on judging the politics. But I think that the vice chairman, Janet Yellen, is very good. But I think that the trouble is that even with the best of analysis and intentions, there's now so little room for maneuver that the fiscal policy propose even the things that you would have thought would automatically happen, like maintaining extended unemployment benefits in the face of this crisis, are actually virtually impossible politically. At the Federal Reserve, anyone who's proposing the kinds of policies that we were all talking about as possibilities 10 years ago now has to run a gauntlet of people within the Fed system who are worried that hyperinflation is just around the corner. So actually the answer is I find myself watching old movies before I go to bed in order to be able to sleep at night.
Thank you for your talk, Professor Krugman. I was actually going to ask you a question about your export strategy to the moon, but...
Yeah. Well, I know. I mean, this is... actually, can I say something? There is... It actually ties in with the last question, but one. In a way, we do have another planet, which is the emerging world, which is doing much better. They're not in this problem. They didn't have a big run-up in debt. They didn't have the housing bubble, and they have inherently, because they are emerging, they have lots of investment opportunities. So this zero lower, the liquidity trap that afflicts the entire advanced world is not a problem And so the emerging world can, to some degree, serve as a locomotive for the world economy, with however, two problems. One is that the biggest player, China, is doing its best to actually push the train backwards, and the other being that they are still not that big. When all is said and done, even, there were headlines about China now being as big an economy as Japan, which is good, but it also means that China is now as big an economy as Japan, and Japan, no one would have think of Japan as being big enough to be a locomotive for the world economy. But the closest thing we have to another planet is, in fact, the emerging markets, but not big enough.
Got it, thank you. So I was just going to ask you about a particular emerging market, maybe a testing site for a moon landing. South Korea, with President Obama having mentioned that he wants some kind of FTA on that. Just given their increased efforts at liberalizing their FDI regime, investments going into Korea from the US, but then also the fact that we still have a current account deficit, what are some of the major pros and cons, and ultimately, which side would you feel is the right way for us to...
For South Korea?
Yeah.
What do I think about the FTA, I guess the question, right?
Yeah.
I don't have strong feelings on it. It's probably a good thing, but not terribly important. In both directions, trade is fairly open, as it is. And let's put it this way: if I were advising Obama, I would say that this is not something to spend political capital on. It's not going to make a significant difference to the U.S. economic situation. It will annoy an important part of your much shrunken base. Don't do it. It's just look, on world trade negotiations. I actually teach a seminar on world trade, on trade policy most years, and a lot of it is historical, because the fact of the matter is that we have a world with very low trade barriers except in agriculture. And there just isn't that much at stake. I mean, if the Doha round falls in a forest and there's nobody to hear it, will make a sound. I mean, it's just sort of, does this stuff matter very much? And I don't think it does. And so on the FTA, it's more symbolic, and the trouble is the symbolism would actually probably be negative for Obama domestically. So, my advice to the South Koreans would be, don't push it, basically.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you for coming, Professor Krugman. I'm a big fan of your column, so I actually agree with one of the things you've been saying probably more repeatedly than just about anything else, which is that the Obama stimulus package was not big enough. But I've been wondering, to what extent in dollars do you think the stimulus should have been larger, and how could it have been more effectively allotted?
Okay. So the measure of, there's a couple ways to say that the stimulus wasn't big enough. One is simpler than the other. So one is just to say, look at government in America as a whole, federal, state, and local, and ask how much increase in government spending did we actually get when all was said and done. And the answer is remarkably little. Government purchases of goods and services, so actually buying stuff, actually grew more slowly over the past 2 years than it had in previous years. So we actually completely failed to deliver any increase in government spending over the previous trend. That's because state and local layoffs of school teachers and such like more than outweighed the little bit of infrastructure that was in the stimulus. So in that sense, the stimulus just wasn't enough to stop us from actually, on net, having a fiscal policy that was contractionary. Now, there's some increase in overall government spending, which is basically unemployment insurance, Medicaid, and food stamps. So basically, more people fell into the safety net, but that's about all that we got. Now, about the Obama stimulus, one way to look at it is that we've got an economy that is running, at least $900 billion a year below capacity. And over a period of several years, and yet a stimulus which over its first 2 years delivered about $600 billion of old stuff. So it's just nowhere near big enough to really match the size of the problem. Plus, 40% was in the form of tax cuts, which almost surely were mostly saved rather than spent. Another large chunk was in the form of aid to state and local governments, which is a good idea, but probably wasn't fully, was supposed to offset cuts at the state and local level, and did, but probably not fully. And the actual, if you're looking for the WPA, if you're looking for the actual things that we think of as stimulus projects, it's only about $100 billion. And it's just not remotely large enough. So what we should have had was something like 1.2 trillion of actual spending, actual building bridges, whatever. That would have been on the scale that would have really been enough. And there are, South Korea did something like that, big spending. And of course, China did a huge, rapid infrastructure development, which is a little bit easier if you don't have to actually pass legislation and you don't worry about corruption. But that's the kind of thing. The scale was way short. I think there could have been a lot more infrastructure spending. Partly this whole obsession with shovel-ready, we need to get stuff out quickly, was a failure to understand that slumps that follow financial crises go on for a very long time. So what we actually have is not, the stimulus actually was doing some serious stuff late last year and early this year, but it's fading out fast now. And of course, that's way premature. So there could have been a lot more. So I would like to have seen lots of signs on the roads saying this bridge repair financed by the Recovery Act. And what you actually see is a few signs on Amtrak stations saying we're fixing the lights with money from the Recovery Act, but that's not quite that's not enough.
Thank you for coming, Dr. Krugman. I would like to say that your theory of interstellar trade is one of my favorite econ papers.
That was written, by the way, in 1978 as a frustrated assistant professor here, sitting there in my office in 28 Hill House, where the heat, as usual, wasn't working.
My question is, I am taking a class by Stephen Roach, who is not a huge fan of your call for a tariff on China, and one of the things that he says is that China is not a market economy, that the huge state-owned enterprises that dominate the export sector have been directed by the central government to maintain high employment in the export sector, and therefore if the U.S. imposes a tariff, that the state-owned enterprise will simply eat the loss. I was wondering your thoughts.
Well, even if that does happen, we've gotten some revenue for free, right? They're just sending us the same stuff at lower prices and helping to close our budget deficit. But I don't quite. Steve, I've been a great admirer of Steve Roach's over the years. I don't understand what he's saying about U.S.-China. A lot of it, he says that the United States needs to save more, which is true, but seems to think that will somehow solve the trade problem without something that gives people an incentive to import less and export more, which has to be a movement in the currency. There's an old John Williamson at the Institute for International Economics used to have this great line about people who believe that you can somehow change trade flows without actually changing prices that gives people an incentive to switch what they're buying. He called it the doctrine of immaculate transfer. And a lot of what Steve's been saying these days sounds to me like he's fallen for the doctrine of immaculate transfer. Yeah, I think this is really. I want to understand what is going to make this harmful Chinese trade surplus go away unless the exchange rate moves. Yeah.
Thanks for coming. I'm a freshman, and I'm kind of one of the reasons I came to Yale is because I figured I'd be able to ask people like you my half-baked questions in public, and so thank you too for giving me the shot at it. I've been reading your article, and also this is Tacitus, and both of you are sufficiently just making me pessimistic about the world and economics and all that. And I'm kind of wondering whether there's anything on a microeconomic level to be done to maybe at least safeguard ourselves from the kind of collapse that's happening around us.
Wow. I don't see it, by the way. I think collapse is the wrong word. You want to think of it as being more like a long siege, a long period of No, think about Japan, right? Now, Japan actually, in some ways, a better social safety net and much less open unemployment than we have. So it's in some ways it looks better. But you go to, if you've gone to Tokyo any time in these 18 years of the Japanese, the lost decade is now 18 years long. If you've gone to Tokyo any time, you don't get the impression of a total disaster, and that's true now. If you go to New York, you don't see. It does not look like 1933, but it's still, there's an awful lot of pain, most of it out of sight. There are things, obviously any individual or any individual company or and to some extent even individual states, local governments can try to find ways to manage. People will make money throughout this. There will be business success stories. And the other thing, but this is as politically impossible, or more so than getting adequate fiscal policy. A decent social safety net makes a huge difference. Europe, in terms of GDP, the Europeans have done a little bit worse than we have actually in this crisis. But there's nothing like the kind of human tragedy going on in the United States and Europe, because people don't lose their health care when they lose their jobs, because in many cases they don't lose their jobs because there are labor laws that make that harder to happen, and because there's an adequate system of basic income even for people who can't find a job. All of the, put it this way, eurosclerosis, all of the things we were talking about, they prevent European dynamism, which with some truth to it, though not as much, but eurosclerosis is serving them pretty well in this crisis, and our highly competitive capitalism red in tooth and claw markets are a real disaster in this situation. So, but individuals, if you, it's still, there will be success stories in business. There will be individuals making their way, although it's a good thing you're a freshman, because right now a graduating senior is facing a pretty bad market. Yeah.
Hi, Professor Krugman. Thank you very much for being here. So I have two related questions. When the Fed is making policy decisions, do you think the Fed should take into account the implications on foreign markets? And do you think that when the Fed announces QE2, they have an intention to lower exchange rate?
Okay, so this is, should the Fed be taking global impacts into account? Yes, some, but it is primarily, the Fed is an American institution. Its primary responsibility is to the U.S. economy. The United States cannot bear the burden of sustaining the world economy on its own. Maybe that was something it could do 40 years ago, but we're as everybody says, it's a bigger world now. There are more players. So QE2, I'm not sure if everybody, right? This is, so we've got quantitative easing, which itself is a terrible phrase because it's a very bad description of what's happening, and now this is supposedly the second round of quantitative easing, and so it all becomes QE2. This is the Fed's policy now of buying long-term U.S. government bonds. It is not actually clear at all that this policy is bad for the rest of the world. Yes, it tends to reduce the U.S. dollar's value, which hurts other countries' exports. But on the other hand, it also, to some extent, expands the U.S. economy, which helps other countries' exports. And if you run through it as a matter of theory, it's definitely ambiguous. And it turns out if you run through it as a matter of run the numbers, it's ambiguous too. Nobody is sure enough to know whether the net effect on the rest of the world's economy is positive or negative. But it's not clearly predatory. And no, I don't think the Fed is doing this primarily to weaken the dollar. I think they're doing it because they're trying to find some traction anywhere. It's supposed to help housing a little bit. It's supposed to encourage corporate borrowing. It's even supposed to, by driving up asset values, encourage consumer spending. It's not a purely exchange rate policy. Think about the contrast with China. People sometimes say, well, isn't this the same thing the Chinese are doing? No, the Chinese are keeping the renminbi down while raising interest rates at home. They're promoting exports while choking off domestic demand. The Fed is trying to push up domestic demand, which has the side effect of also pushing down the dollar. But it's, I think the rest of the world has, actually, the discussion going on in some of the econo-blogs. Econo-blogging is a great thing. We actually have this really interesting discussion going on in real time between smart people. But one of the blog posts I read this morning began, what is the German for hypocrite? Which actually turns out to be Heuchler. But anyway, it's amazing to see as someone else wrote, I think this is actually someone of, that the Germans are getting really upset because the United States is undermining their bigger than neighbor strategy for recovery. So anyway.
We'll take one more question.
All right.
No pressure. So I guess with reference to your metaphor of the nightmare, it seems that we have sort of an environment of possible deflation. John Mackin said on Bloomberg Surveillance yesterday that there's sharp drop in the money multiplier and the velocity of money now that shows that inflation is slowing and possibly alluding to deflation. And there also seems to be a lack of confidence in the market where small businesses don't really know what's going to happen with taxes, the Dodd-Frank bill, healthcare. So in that environment and the fact that we have political gridlock, what do you think some political reform could be to get us out of this nightmare?
Well, that's the thing. If we hadn't had the filibuster in January 2009, then we might have had a lot more aggressive policies than we actually had. I mean, everything was really dictated by what could get those 60 senators. And so that's a political, if we do get some reform of the filibuster, which by the way has changed enormously. People think that it always used to be that you needed 60 senators to get anything done, and it was not true. It used to be that the filibuster was used on a very sparing basis, but since increasingly over the years, it's become a standard way to block anything you don't like. So the United States, it's kind of unique actually among advanced countries in that getting anything done requires a supermajority. So that would have helped. But of course, at this point, even if you didn't require 60 senators, you still have to have economic policies that Harry Reid and John Boehner agree on, and that's not going to get you very far. Beyond that, I don't know. I mean, I think the problem at this point is it's not a simple matter of political institutions. It's a problem of perception. And it's a problem of understanding. Actually, there was another one of the political bloggers I was reading the other day said we worry a lot about gross misunderstanding or gross misinformation. We worry about people who actually believe that Barack Obama is a secret Muslim or that he's spending $200 million a day in India or something. But what really damages us is the people who have more softer misinformation, who think that a recession is like a harvest failure, that our ability to produce has been reduced and therefore everybody, including the government, should tighten their belts. And so what we really need at some level is a process of education, of getting getting some better understanding of the economic choices out there, and which is hard. It is amazing, I can say, as a personal reflection, to realize how you can be granted this amazing thing, which is the use of the most valuable journalistic real estate on the planet twice a week, and still feel completely powerless to influence public perceptions, which is pretty much the way I feel. But all I can say is we keep on doing that, and we keep on trying to get the story out. Back to Keynes. If you ever read Keynes's General Theory, the great book, it concludes with this famous passage about the importance of ideas. And I think the last words are, in the long run, it is ideas, not vested interests, which are dangerous for good or evil. What he didn't say was whether the ideas that were dangerous for good would prevail. And I'm afraid that evil is winning at the moment, but we keep on trying. Thanks.